We're going to be learning the Malachos that are forbidden to do on Shabbos. The Torah says you shall not work on Shabbos. But what does that mean? There are many things that we would consider to be hard work that you're allowed to do on Shabbos, and there are many things that we would consider not to be work at all, and they are forbidden to be done on Shabbos. So how does this work? So, no pun intended, by the way. So the way it works is like this. It says in the Torah that you shall build the tabernacle, the mobile temple that accompanied us in the desert. You shall build this temple. And the Torah puts that commandment of building the temple right next to where the Torah says you shall not work on Shabbos. So the Talmud learns from this that whatever is forbidden to be done on Shabbos is the very same things that were done to build the Mishkan. In other words, the Torah is telling us don't do whatever you need to do to build a Mishkan on Shabbos. Whatever was involved in making that tabernacle cannot be done on Shabbos. You're allowed to do anything else, just you can't do whatever would be done to build the tabernacle. In the language of the Alter Rebbe, he says, although the Torah says in Siman Shin Aleph, Sif Aleph, although the Torah says do not do any work, it doesn't say what kind of work, but since the Torah juxtaposes the commandment of Shabbos to the commandment of building the Mishkan, we learn from there that building the Mishkan does not push off Shabbos. You can't build the Mishkan on Shabbos, and therefore whatever is done to build the Mishkan can't be done on Shabbos. So what are those things that were done to build the Mishkan? So the Mishnah and the Rambam reckon 39 different things that were done to build the Mishkan, and those things are the ones we're not allowed to do on Shabbos. But it doesn't say in the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah, it doesn't say exactly what those things are. It just says the laws, it says the details. It just says don't do A, B, and C. It doesn't say why you shouldn't do that. It doesn't say is this considered one of the 39 Malachos or not. Only in the Mishnah, only in the Rambam does it say the 39 Malachos, but in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, doesn't mention any of the 39 Malachos. However, the Alter Rebbe, in his Shulchan Aruch, he does describe the 21 of the 39 Malachos, and he tells us which ones are, he defines them, and he tells us what the biblical prohibition is, what's forbidden midaraisa. And the reason why this is pertinent, even though the reason that the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah made this is because the purpose of Shulchan Aruch, the word Shulchan Aruch means a set table, it just tells us what we need to do. So since the purpose of the Code of Jewish Law is to tell us what we need to do, it doesn't really matter why we can't do it as long as it's forbidden, it's forbidden. But the Alter Rebbe does go into the reasons and the sources for the 39 Malachos because there are various nafkaminas, there are various halachic nuances and changes depending upon why something is forbidden. For example, if something is forbidden midaraisa, if it's one of the 39 Malachos, so not only can you not do it yourself, but you can ask a non-Jew to do it for you on Shabbos either. If it's forbidden because it's one of the 39 Malachos, not only is it forbidden for you to do it, but even if it's a suffix, even if it's a doubt whether or not this thing is one of the 39 Malachos or not, but if it's questionable, the general rule is suffix daraisa l'chumra. If something is a question, if it's biblically forbidden or not, we say you should be strict and not do it. Versus if something is only rabbinically forbidden, then the rule is that you could be lenient. So the question of whether something is considered one of the 39 Malachos or not is important, and it's pertinent to those two scenarios about whether you're allowed to tell a non-Jew to do this, or whether if there's a suffix, if there's a doubt, should you be strict or should you be lenient? If it's biblically forbidden, then it's, even if it's a suffix, even if it's a doubt, it's also forbidden. Now, there's also a third nafkamina. There's a concept called gzeira l'gzeira. Our sages tell us that there are certain things we shouldn't do to put a fence around the Torah. There's things which are forbidden biblically, and the Torah says that our sages should make a fence around those biblical prohibitions so that lest we transgress one of the big ones. So the sages only put a fence around those things which are biblically forbidden. But something which is only forbidden rabbinically, there's no reason to put an additional fence on it. So therefore, whether or not something is considered biblically forbidden or rabbinically forbidden is important for these three questions and many others. That's why the Alter Rebbe does address what is considered one of the 39 biblical malachos, one of the 39 biblical things that are forbidden to do on Shabbos. If you look at the Mishnah lists the 39 malachos. It lists them in a very funny way. It says there's 40 minus 1. And the reason the Mishnah does this is because it's giving us some insight to what work is, period. Why we have to go to work at all. Just like the Jewish people did work in the tabernacle to create a place for God, so too throughout the week, what we're really trying to do is to create a place for Hashem. Although Hashem is telling us it's not Shabbos, go out and do mundane things, it's not mundane. Hashem is telling us to engage in these 39 things during the week to create a space for Hashem. That's why the Mishnah says it's 40 minus 1. There's something else that we're into when we're doing our work during the week. We're trying to bring Hashem into the mundane things, the mundane activities we do during the week. So that's why the Mishnah doesn't say there's 39. It wants us to know that we're missing one. And you're doing many different things, but you should know it's all about the one. It's all about the oneness of Hashem. You want to bring Hashem into all the things that you're doing. Just like in the desert, they're building a place for Hashem. So too throughout your week, you're also building a place for Hashem. And on Shabbos, you are forbidden to work. You're forbidden to create a place for Hashem. And Shabbos is more about being in the place of Hashem, praying and studying Torah and being with your family. Instead of doing those things to create, on Shabbos is just about being in the presence of Hashem. Shabbos, letting it all go. So there are 39 malachos, and the first one that's listed in the Mishnah is a funny one. The first one that's listed in the Mishnah is baking. Now, baking isn't not the first one. Excuse me, not the first one. It's one of the malachos listed in the Mishnah is baking, and there was no baking in the Mishkan. In this tabernacle, there's no baking. There was cooking. They cooked various herbs to produce the dye that was needed to dye the various curtains and the ceiling, the roof of the tabernacle. They had to dye those animal hides that were used. They had to first cook the herbs. So there was cooking, but there's no baking. So how come the Mishnah mentions baking? So the Talmud asks this question. The Talmud says, Shavak Tanid Dan. The author of the Mishnah does not want to talk about cooking. He wants to talk about baking. Why? The Mishnah wants us to have all of the 39 malachos down pat. It wants us to know them. And therefore, it's not pertinent for us to know how it was done specifically in the Mishnah necessarily. We just have to know it in a way that we'll remember it. And therefore, the Mishnah groups the 39 malachos, the 39 things that are forbidden to do on Shabbos, in 4 groups, so that would be easy for us to relate to them and easy for us to remember them. So the Mishnah lists the first 11 of the 39 malachos are how to make bread. There was no bread in the Mishkan. Of course, in the Mishkan there was lechem apanim. There was the showbread, but the showbread was not part of the construction of the tabernacle. That's something that was used later on when the tabernacle was built. But there was no baking in the construction of the tabernacle. But the Mishnah chooses to talk about baking because the Mishnah wants us to have a full picture and a full way of remembering all of the malachos. So it says the first 11 are related to how bread is made. Then the second 9 of the second group of 9 malachos are how to make a garment. That already was clearly in the Mishkan. They made the various curtains and they made the garments for the priests to use in the temple. So there was 9 malachos involved in making clothing, but and then there's a third and a fourth group involved. A third group of making a Sefer Torah, and again there was no Sefer Torah that was that was needed, no writing of Sefer Torah, mezuzah, tefillin in the Mishkan, but the Mishnah lists a group of malachos just because it's easier for us to remember it as a group. So it lists a group of making how a Sefer Torah was made. So we'll be able to have that in our mind and remember all of the different components of making a Sefer Torah. They're all forbidden on Shabbos. And the fourth group is how to build a house. So let's go through these four groups. The first group is how to make bread. Well, making bread, the first thing is you have to, first of all, before I get into making bread for a second, I just want to point out, in the Mishkan, although I mentioned before that there were herbs that were used to dye the curtains, how did they plow and plant? They were traveling the desert. Well, there's no plowing and planting. So there is a Tosfos in Tosfos addresses this question in Chulin, page 88b. Tosfos says that wherever the Jewish people traveled, they had the well of Miriam, and because they had the well of Miriam, the miraculously traveled with them, that will cause things to grow. So in the middle of the desert, they actually had the herbs growing with them while they were traveling. That's how Tosfos addresses this question. Others address this question and say that they didn't actually plant it then, but they had to plant it before, as the Torah says that Yaakov planted many things in Egypt to prepare for our departure from Egypt. So Jacob planted the shittim wood and other things so that we should have it ready to take it with us when we were going to build the tabernacle. So although there was no actual plowing and planting in the desert, but the Torah is describing things that were done earlier. Either way, the first step in producing this dye or producing the bread, as the Mishnah wants us to remember, that this group is to plow. After you plow, that's the first malacha, the first thing that's forbidden on Shabbos. Then there's planting. Once you plant and you have something that grows, so now you have to take the thing that has grown and you have to harvest it. Koitzer, that's a third of the 39 malachos. You're now allowed to harvest on Shabbos as well. After you harvest it, so now you have to process it. The first step of processing it is ma'amer. Ma'amer means to gather it together, gather all the different wheat husks together. Just because you gather it together doesn't mean you have bread yet. You have to now take these wheat husks and you have to get the kernels out of the wheat husks. So how do you do that? So the next step is dash. What's dash? They used to have animals which were attached to these large pieces of wood. And on the bottom of the pieces of wood, there was glass and iron that to use to crack open the wheat husks. So a person would direct the animal, would stand on top of the wood and direct the animal back and forth over the wheat husks so that the kernels would come out of the wheat husks. So, but even though you've now separated the kernels from the wheat husks, you're still far from the bread because you have now the kernels mixed together with all these with the husks, with the straw-like part of the wheat. So what do you do? So what was done was zoira. Zoira means to take all of this mixture you have together, throw it. We wait for a wind. When there's a wind, you throw it in the air, and because the kernels are heavier than the chaff, heavier than the straw-like part of the wheat, so the straw-like part of it would get thrown by the wind, and the kernels would fall in their place. And so that's how you would separate between the wheat husks and the kernels. But you're not done yet, because now you still have some of the chaff and straw-like part of the wheat mixed together with all the kernels. Most of it has been separated, but still some is there, and also it's on the ground. The ground is full of dirt and stones, so you don't really have kernels yet separated. So what you do is you put it on a table, and on the table you take all the kernels and you separate and you take off all of the remaining chaff and any pebbles that I'm getting mixed in. And that is boirer. That's the next step of next malacha. You're now allowed to separate on Shabbos. After boirer, after you've now separated, now you have these kernels. Now you have to grind them. So that's the next malacha. Toichin. Toichin is one of the 39 malachos. After you grind it, so people consider having all the flour to be healthier. Whole wheat is considered healthier, but let's say you wanted to have the tastier part of the, okay, that's arguable, it's tastier, but anyways, you wanted to separate the subin, the mursan. You wanted to separate the better parts of the grain from the others. So you put it through a sieve, and the thicker part remains on top, and the fine flour comes on the bottom. And that's how you separate from the mursan, from the whole wheat, and the flour. So that is another one of the 39 malachos. Now you have the flour. You're not done yet. Now you have to take the flour and mix it with water and to knead it. That's another one of the 39 malachos. And after you knead it, then finally you bake the bread. So that's the first group of the 39 malachos. The first 11 malachos. Sorry, the first. The first 11 malachos are involved in baking bread, and the next 13 malachos are about making clothing. Make clothing. So the first step is to shear the wool off the animal. And the Mishkan, we had this because in the Mishkan they had the animal hides, and after you shave the wool off the animal, you weren't yet done. There's still a lot more to do because the wool of the sheep is all entangled and crusty and dirty. And the first thing you have to do is you have to menapetz. You have to separate all the various strands of wool. After you separate the strands of wool, then before you try to process into making a garment, you want to dye the wool. Because if you dye the wool after it's already been produced into thread, the dye won't properly be koilet as ayin, won't properly become part of the wool, and therefore you have to dye the wool immediately after you take the wool off of the sheep. So you take the wool off the sheep and you do menapetz, and then you put it into a yoyret, put it into a pot, and you dye it, and now you're ready to make the threads. Now there's 4 malachos involved making the threads. It's hard to convey exactly how that works on this video, so I'm going to skip those for now, and God willing, we'll get back to them another time. But right now, we're going to go to the third group of malachos. The third group of malachos are how to make a sefer torah. There are 9 malachos involved making a sefer torah. The animal hide isn't really ready to, after it's been skinned, which is one of the 3 malachos, skinning the animal, isn't yet ready to be used to write a sefer torah on it yet, because after you've skinned the animal, you still have to the skin of the animal on one side, it still has some flesh, still has some of the meat of the animal, some of the flesh of the animal. And the other side, you have the hair of the animal. And the laws of a sefer torah, one side is called duchsustus, one side is called gvil. It's not really pertinent to the laws of Shabbos, but for our purposes, in order to make the animal hide proper to be able to write a sefer torah on it, the next step is that you have to take the animal hide and you have to do what's called memachik. You have to smoothen it out so that there's no hair on the animal, and there's no the flesh is on the animal. And now, after you have you've done that, so the next step is to take the the next step is, after you have taken it off, you now have to cut the hide to size so that the hide will be fitting to write the sefer torah. You want to use the entire animal hide. That's called mechatech. After mechatech, so then you have to write lines on the Sefer Torah. In order for Sefer Torah to be kosher, there has to be lines on there. That's called Masartet. And after you have finished that, now the Sefer Torah is now ready to be written on, and that ends that group of malachos. Now this brings us to the fourth group of malachos, the malachos involved in building a house. This, of course, is directly relevant to making the Mishkan, because the Mishkan, you built the Mishkan. So boine v'soiser, building or destroying, are forbidden on Shabbos. And there's also, if you build a vessel in a house, you need to have furniture as well. So building a vessel is also considered forbidden on Shabbos. It's called makeh bepatish, the final blow that creates a vessel. If it's a very important vessel, then it's considered part of the building of the house. But if it's not such an important vessel, if you're able to create a vessel with one final blow, one final thing that you're doing, so that final act of creating the vessel is called makeh bepatish. After you have created your vessels and you're all good with your vessels, now you need to put the lights on in your house. So there's a next malacha is mavir, turning on a fire, and then you want to turn the fire off, machabe, extinguishing the fire. And the last of the 39 malachas is hoitzah. Hoitzah means it's forbidden to take things inside and outside of your house. I just want to point out the last malacha is a very unique malacha. All of the other 39 malachas are part of creating something. In the action of bringing something inside or outside a domain, not really creating anything. And therefore, we wouldn't think that this is something that's forbidden on Shabbos. And that's why the Torah goes out of its way to add extra verses to tell us that it's forbidden to carry on Shabbos as well. And there are also many things that are forbidden to do on Shabbos as a precaution, lest we end up carrying on Shabbos. In the Mishkan, there was carrying. For example, the Levites would carry the various boards from the wagons to the main square, if you will, of the Mishkan. So they would carry from a private domain to a public domain. Also, when people brought the gifts to give the Mishkan, to create the Mishkan from their homes, they brought from their homes gifts to the public square, from the private domain to the public domain, to be given to the Mishkan. And the Torah says that people should stop doing it. Why should they stop doing it? Because on Shabbos, you're not allowed to carry from the private domain to the public domain. Those are the 39 malachas. I just forgot to mention two more malachas. In the process of making the Sefer Torah, the first step is to capture the deer, and then there is skinning the deer. And after skinning the deer, there is, before you can mafshit, before you besides mimachik, besides smoothing it out, you also want to ma'abed. You also want to put chemicals and all kinds of stuff on the animal hide right away, which is very important. Like, for example, on the laws of Yontif, it is permitted on Yontif to slaughter an animal if you need food on Yontif. However, there is no need on Yontif to work on the animal hide. So if someone has a scenario where they need to slaughter an animal on Yontif, you're going to run into a problem because they're going to slaughter the animal, and because there's still flesh attached to the animal hide, they're going to be stuck, and the animal hide is going to get ruined, because if you leave the animal hide attached to the animal hide attached to the flesh for a long time, it's going to get ruined. And therefore, there is a whole discussion in a court of Jewish law about what you should do on Yontif and how it's possible to put the salt or whatever chemicals you're going to use to make the animal hide softer and to work it over, how it's allowed to be done on Yontif, various tricks, so to speak, madim, and to put another piece of meat on the animal hide when you season it, so that way the animal hide will get seasoned as well. So that is another part of the malachos of Shabbos, not just capturing the deer, not just skinning it, but also working the hide with various salt and other things to make the animal hide usable, so that you're able to be memachik and then to write on the Sefer Torah. I also didn't mention the malacha of kosher, that after you have in the second group, the malachos of creating a garment, is also once you have the thread and the material, and you have the garment, there's another malacha involved in the process of making a garment, that's tying something together and untying, and that is basically all the 39 malachos. That's what I wanted to share tonight. Any questions, Yehuda? Thank you for listening, Yehuda. Your birthday's coming up. I hope we're having a geschmack of farbrengen coming up too. Any questions, Yehuda?
No, thank you very much. I appreciate.
I can hear you. Go ahead.
I said thank you very much. I really appreciate.
I can't hear you. Thought I can hear you. You know, mic, I guess. All right.
All right.